Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
On this episode of The Nation of Taxpayers with me, Duncan Barks, we welcome back into the podcast studio Elliot Keck from the TPA.
Good to see Duncan. It's been a few weeks.
It has, yes. You've been missed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
greatly.
Very much so. And we welcome debut appearance on The Nation of Taxpayers, Emma Revell, External Affairs Director for the Centre for Policy Studies. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Good to have you here. Obviously, people are now aware of your role, but just a little bit of your Westminster journey today. Where have you been before?
Well, I started at the Centre for Policy Studies, so
Yeah.
I've actually ended up back in exactly the same place. But I joined Westminster as a very junior comms officer
Yeah.
at the CPS in 2017.
Yeah.
I did a couple of years at the Institute of Economic Affairs.
Yes, of course.
I tried to lead think tanks, worked at the British Retail Consortium for a year and a bit, thought
Yeah.
I'd get a proper job.
Yeah.
Very much enjoyed it, learnt a lot, and then got a call saying, do you want to come back to the CPS? And I went, go on then.
What's the lure then of the CPS? If you come back, what's the attraction?
Well, I love working there. I love
Yeah.
the people. Rob Colville's a fab director, and I think it was great. It's always nice to get a call from someone you've worked with before saying, could you come back?
Yeah.
Like, we think you'd be perfect for this role. And that's, a massive...
It's a ringing endorsement, isn't it?
It's a massive confidence boost. Whereas, if you're looking at just applying for a new job out of the blue, is this for me? Will I like the organisation?
Yeah.
I wasn't walking into a new job where I'd met every single person who worked there before I came back. Even if they were new and had joined while I'd been away, I had met them all through events and just the Westminster sort of culture.
There's nothing like the chaos of Westminster.
Yeah, exactly. It calls to you.
It's addictive.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It is addictive.
I came back because my predecessor got a special advisor job with Liz Truss, so chaos was
brilliant.
indeed the right term, I think.
And what's the CPS been up to over the last few months?
Well, I think the biggest thing is our annual Margaret Thatcher conference. So it was mid-March. We looked at the theme of remaking conservatism, which, when you're thinking about it a year ahead, we hadn't had the election yet. It hadn't been called. It was our 50th anniversary last year. And we were thinking, well, there's going to be this massive event in March. It's either going to be after an election defeat of some level for the centre-right, or, maybe it's a small minor Labour government majority. It's not massive, but there will still need to be some reckoning with 14 years of government. What's the future of the right? What comes next?
Yeah.
What are the policies? What are the perceptions? Which I think is one of the big things we talked about as well. What do people feel about people on the right? And it's not great. And how do we overcome that? As much as what are the policies that we need to help win votes?
And if any listeners are doing the maths and trying to work out what happened 50 years ago, it's probably worth clarifying. The Centre for Policy Studies, of course, was set up one of the last times that the Conservatives had a major election defeat in 1974, and it was set up by Margaret Thatcher herself and Keith Joseph.
Yeah, so we're very proud of our founders, and it was a big anniversary year for us last year.
Let's just spend a few moments talking about the legacy of Lady Thatcher. Do you think that it's harder than ever to fly the flag for what she believed in? In our current climate?
I don't know if it's harder now than it was when she was doing it the first time. But in any time since, yes, I think so, because the public don't believe it. I think there are elements of it that chime with the public, but the public perception of the Conservative Party, after the scale of the election defeat, it's very rarely been lower. So it's the difficulty of aligning the message, the messenger, the policy. If you take the ideas out of context and out of branding and go, well, what do you think about this? People might go, oh, no, actually, we do agree with that. Yeah. But once you package it up with the centre-right as it currently is, it's tricky.
I also think there's an issue as well that the further we go on, look, I'm an old man, right? So I remember, I was born in the early 1970s. I remember the tail end of the 70s and the early 80s when this country was just trashed, right? So I've experienced, I've witnessed, I've seen what it was like when you had a trailblazer like Maggie come in and change this country for the better. But obviously, as time goes on, people like me get older, and generations coming through don't have that point of reference, do they?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of similarities, I think, now with what we saw in the late 1970s, particularly with reports that the unions are planning a summer of discontent. They're looking at what's happening in Birmingham with the bin crisis and thinking we could replicate this across the country in order to sort of twist the arm of the government a little bit. But I think there's also a risk on the other side, which is that ultimately, for all Thatcher's merits and brilliant time in office, it was 35 years ago. And if we're continuously reaching for a metaphor, for a model that is now decades old and existed in a very, very different time with many different challenges, there is a risk that, right-wing politics and right-wing solutions get sort of ossified a bit and a bit stuck in the past. And there is this frustration I get sometimes with some of these, particularly Conservative MPs, that are just always reaching for Margaret Thatcher. And, I'm thinking, you just had 14 years in government, and then it's so revealing that there's nothing that you're nothing you're grabbing for, reaching for in the last 14 years. And actually, what are your solutions for the future rather than just harking back to the past?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. A few years ago, when I was doing some work for a Conservative MP, he went to a school to give a talk about life as an MP, as they often do on a Friday afternoon in the constituency. And he made what I thought was a mistake, because all of these kids were like 8 or 9 years old. And one of them said, "Who is your hero?" And he went, "Margaret Thatcher." And they were like, "Huh?
Yeah, who?
Huh?" So I think whilst we should celebrate what she achieved, I think you're right, Elliot. It speaks volumes when you say that today's Conservative MPs talk about someone who, was in government decades ago, and you can't look back on the last 14 years and say, well, we did this, we did that, or this is my hero, or this is what we've achieved.
Yeah, and I think probably a recent example that demonstrates this is that of British Steel. Now, under the sort of Thatcherite analysis, you wouldn't privatise British Steel. You'd say, allow it to fail. It's a failing industry, and there's a really, really good argument for that. Generally, government is really, really bad at running things, and we should try and move away from the nationalisation of anything. However, the threat that we faced in the 1980s was the Soviet Union, which by the 1980s had completely decimated its own industrial base. Whereas now the threat we face is China, which is a booming, thriving economy. So the risk of not having our own steel production, I think, is greater now than it was in the 1980s. Even if you may say nationalisation bad, privatisation good, and let failing industries fail, that traditional answer, that traditional solution, does that still work in the case of British Steel now? And that's, I think, a bit of an open
Well, let's
debate.
spend a bit of time talking about this, because it's been one of the, if not the big political story of the last 7 days. I'm really torn with it, if I'm honest with you, because I think... the older I get, I find myself thinking there are certain things that are a no-brainer to me, and in no particular order. That is border security, energy security, and food security. I've now added steel security to my list, because I think we can't rely on other countries. The world has changed significantly for many reasons. Then I find myself thinking, we make our own steel. That's a sensible thing to do. Virgin steel, primary steel's the phrases that have been knocking around. But how do we fund it? Is it something we should take a hit on and nationalise it? Or do we look to the private sector to invest? Then you look at the current figures. I mean, the plant in Scunthorpe was losing £700,000 a day, right? Well, no private enterprise in their right mind is going to get involved in that. So what do we do?
Yeah, I mean, you said you find it difficult. I find it even more difficult. I'm from Scunthorpe. Yeah. So there's that sort of... It's so dominant on the skyline of the town. I've spoken a lot over recent years about, actually, I think it's more dominant for the psychology of the town than the economy, because actually steel has been dying an incredibly slow death. I remember when I was a kid, and you want to go into town, and your parents would go, "Oh, don't go that way, don't go the bottom road, because it's shift change and the traffic's going to be mad. So either wait half an hour or go a different way into town." That's not been true for 15 years. You don't notice shift change anymore, because there's not as many blast furnaces on as there were. There's actually 4. Sure. There's only 2 still operating, but there are 4 that you can see. Yeah. It obviously would be a massive hit to the economy of the town, but I think it would be more of a psychological hit to the town. And if you're looking to get investment from other industries, other sectors, bringing in other organisations to invest and to create jobs, if the town is really feeling down and out and like there's no hope, it needs the hope as much as it needs the economic boost of the steel.
I think the psychological angle is absolutely bang on. I mean, I did some media over the weekend and we spent a lot of time talking about this, and the headline figure is kind of like almost 3,000 jobs might be lost. It's like it's bigger than that, right? You've got the ripple effects of the economy as well. You've got families who would therefore be impacted if the main breadwinner wasn't working there anymore. So the ripple effects go far and wide. What do we do about it though? So you've got skin in the game, being a Scunthorpe girl. What is the answer?
I don't think nationalisation is ever the answer for any industry.
Right.
I think government, just ideologically and based out by the evidence, government is particularly bad at running big organisations of any kind. No one here is going to disagree with that. But the position that the Scunthorpe plant has been pushed to, with the private owner withholding supplies to keep the thing running, and once it stops, you can't turn it back on, as it were. I can completely understand why the government felt you have to step in, because what is the alternative? If it was at the stage where they only had enough coal and coke to keep going for 48 hours, you do have to make a decision at that point. I think the lack of a long-term plan concerns me. Is this nationalisation for good? Is this nationalisation for 6 months? 5 years? What is the plan? And I don't think the government has an answer to that.
Yeah, there was a really good piece in CAPEX, which was the Centre for Policy Studies sort of online publication, and by Harry Phibbs, and he made the point that every single time that there's a complete political and media consensus on an issue, it tends to be a disaster. So lockdown, HS2 and net zero were three that he pointed at, and of course we now have that similar consensus on the at the moment what is only a partial nationalisation, but which looks almost certain to be heading for full nationalisation of British Steel. I think where I'm sympathetic to the nationalisation, albeit sceptical nevertheless, is that one of the reasons why British Steel is now unviable is because of terrible government policy. British Steel, by all accounts, is incredibly high quality product, but that just costs a vast amount of money to make. And what's the reason why it costs a vast amount of money to make? Well, it's primarily high energy costs. The reason why blast furnaces are being turned off is actually a deliberate part of the net zero push. It's to move to these electric furnaces, right? And then, you just a few months ago, we had a permission for a coking plant in Cumbria. And, for listeners, coke is basically the sort of process type of coal that you absolutely need to produce virgin steel. It's one of the sort of two absolutely key ingredients. We like trying to bake a cake without flour. That got turned down. So as a result, we're having to import coal from abroad.
Well, it was Mad Ed, wasn't it? Mad Ed
question
Miliband
is,
said no.
Are you going to bring down those costs for British Steel and actually make it, or give it the chance to be a viable industry, maybe with a small amount of government support because of national security reasons? Or are you going to continue your energy policies, your policies towards mining and all the rest of it, to ensure that British Steel not only remains completely unviable and economically damaging, but then also having the bill footed by taxpayers?
It's really difficult. Where do you stand on? I've got two questions related to this, and I'd be fascinated to hear your answers. That there was this line that was being developed over the weekend that this was always China's plan to damage Britain by making sure we couldn't produce our own virgin steel. There was even a piece in the Sunday Times, which the MOD ended up saying was not the case, but Sunday Times over the last weekend saying that they were looking at having a naval ship to escort a merchant sea vessel that had coke on board. Not that kind of coke, the coke furnaces. I mean, is that too much of a conspiracy, that this was a deliberate ploy by China to damage us?
My understanding is that under Chinese law, companies within China have to abide by the Communist Party diktat, if that diktat comes. Now, we don't know if that diktat has come in this case. At the same time, there will be loads of companies that just want to make a profit, run a company well. It's certainly a concern, but I don't think we know enough of the details.
What do you reckon, Emma? Bit of a conspiracy?
I'm more inclined to believe it's government failure here in the UK than conspiracy elsewhere. Like Elliot says, it's possible because that's the sort of operational situation in China. But that wouldn't have been possible if we hadn't had the highest energy costs in Western Europe, the developed world.
I think that's right, isn't it?
So we've enabled this to happen.
Yeah. China is not responsible for our energy costs.
Yeah.
It's that simple.
What do we make of Reform UK, who came out and said, look, there's no debate about this, we need to nationalise it? Now, I mean, I think this puts Reform in quite an interesting place, because up until recently, it's almost like, don't vote for the Tories, vote for us. Oh, actually now, we realise there's growth in the north of England, so we're just going to go, oh, no, steel, very important, let's nationalise it. Where do you think this leads Reform UK in terms of what they stand for economically?
Well, I think electorally it puts them in a strong position with local elections ongoing. But economically it's incredibly difficult because Nigel Farage has for decades had incredibly borderline libertarian economic instincts. And
well, he's banged on about Margaret Thatcher at every given opportunity.
More than most Tories, I think. And has, in the fairly recent past, said, absolutely nationalisation is not the answer, and then spent the whole weekend in Scunthorpe going, absolutely, we must nationalise it immediately. So
what is that? Is that opportunistic behaviour?
I think, it sort of comes back to this. Are Reform going to be saying, we should have British Steel nationalised in perpetuity for the sake of nationalisation's sake, because it's better for, the British people, when we say the British people, we mean British bureaucrats, to own a certain industry? Or is it, no, hold on, this is a really important industry that we have clobbered as a result of terrible government policy. Let's sort out the government policy, but in the meantime, don't let it die. Because as Emma said, these blast furnaces, once they turn off, they're off. The amount of money it costs to get them back going, because the damage it does as a result of the cooling process and all the rest of it. So there is an argument that if you can get the policy right on, the stuff we've been talking about, a temporary nationalisation is the right solution. But if your answer is just no, we should own British Steel because it's just brilliant it makes us feel good inside, then I don't think that is good policy, and I think that does suggest Reform are moving towards a more populist economics that won't deliver results in the long term.
And just a final question, just listening to you talk there, Elliot, about what we saw with Parliament being recalled on a Saturday during recess, the first time during recess on a Saturday since the Falklands invasion in 1982. There were some people who were rather cynical about this, going, well, hang on a second, you knew this was coming down the tracks. You could have done this before recess kicked in, the Tuesday before the weekend. This is just a bit of a convenient distraction from all of the other stuff that's going on, and actually looks quite good on the run up to the local elections. What do we make of that?
Well, I think again, I'm more inclined to believe that it's not a conspiracy, that it is just a bit of parliamentary mismanagement, a bit of a Labour government who've been in opposition for 14 years and didn't necessarily comprehend the timescales, were overly optimistic that a solution could be found.
Took their eye off the ball, maybe?
And a little bit, and then thought, oh Jesus, we've got to do this, and it's a Saturday, and we're going to have to bring everybody back.
I was just a bit sick of all of these MPs all over social media going, oh look, I'm getting on a train, I'm going to work on a Saturday. It's like, welcome to the real world.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think a lot of people have had a bit of a baptism of fire with sort of learning about steel and the difference between virgin steel and blast furnaces and electric furnaces and coking coal and all the rest of it. It's entirely possible that someone's come into Jonathan Reynolds' office and be like, hold on, when I said it's a crisis, I mean, like, if we don't get coking coal into this blast furnace in 48 hours, the whole thing's going to melt down and shut down, and you're not going to be able to start it up again. So it's a bit harsh probably to say taking eye off the ball. Jonathan Reynolds is not going to be an expert on every single part of British industry and the sort of the minutiae on it. That's what his officials are there for. But at the same time, his officials are coming to him on loads of issues all at once, and what he may have thought was a slightly longer time frame may have drastically shortened. So I don't think it's good parliamentary management when MPs have had a pretty bruising, particularly Labour MPs have had a pretty bruising few months. I don't think it's great parliamentary management to say, hold on, you need to drop your holidays and get on the first plane back to London.
Let's stick with MPs for a second, because I know you two come at MPs' pay from two very different angles. I've seen you do some telly on this, and I want to revisit it on our podcast here. So we're recording this in the middle of April, brand new financial year. MP salary is now currently standing, because I had an increase, at £93,904 a year. There are expenses bolted onto that. I prefer the term allowances. I think expenses can be a little bit misleading. But let's talk about the base salary, right? Are they worth it, Elliot?
I think Not at present, no.
Right.
I think I could imagine a crop of MPs, much smaller crop of MPs ideally, who are worth that salary and maybe even worth a higher salary. But we've barely seen GDP per capita, i.e. actually living standards, grow for years and years and years. And that is because time and time again, MPs put sectoral interests, often particularly the interest of their constituents, which I sympathise with, but ultimately has led to the country being poorer. And they put those interests over the interests of the rest of the country and over living standards. And so, the fact that they get frequent pay rises, I do find to be difficult to justify.
What should be the salary for an MP then?
Well, I think it's not about just the baseline salary. Right. I think a better scheme, I think you need to take out accommodation and travel, because it's not reasonable to expect, Alistair Carmichael, who's having to schlep down from the Shetland Islands once a week, to be, taking those travel costs on himself, whereas, an MP from Islington or Harlow or whatever doesn't need a second home, can walk to Parliament if you live in central London. But I think a much larger remuneration package that does include all of your staff expenses and things like that. Because I think, and then going, you can spend this however you want. If you want to employ 2 people in your office and pay them, £75,000 a year, crack on. If you want to employ, 5 22-year-olds fresh out of uni and only pay them 30 grand a year, fine. I think we should give MPs a lot more freedom in that, but within a package of money which will include their own salary but also expenses of that nature. And just say, this is the pot. Do with it as you see fit. If you want to take half of it for you and not have as many staff, or if you want to pay yourself a bit less and hire more people, I think giving MPs a bit of freedom over and control of that nature, I think it will lead to MPs being paid more. And I think if you are looking, especially on, the Conservative side and thinking, well, why do we not attract these people who have incredibly high-powered jobs, who've run their own businesses? It's like, well, you're asking them to take
a pay cut,
50% in a lot of cases if you look at MPs in their previous jobs. So I think pay is part of it, but I also think the job of being an MP is incredibly difficult. I agree that the quality of some MPs is not great, but the logistics of just doing the job, what you have to deal with, what you're dealing with in your constituency, you're basically subbing in for a council in a lot of cases. You're picking up a lot of failure elsewhere.
It's almost like being a social worker.
It's a very unattractive job for a lot of people. And I think people have this perception that once you're not an MP anymore, you can go on to earn hundreds of thousands of pounds. That's true for 10, 15 MPs. It's, the cabinet, the prime ministers, the leaders of the opposition. It's not true for the majority of backbenchers. And we've seen that in people who lost at the last election, not many, but some who've spoken publicly about actually it's really actually quite difficult to find a job now.
Jonathan Gullis has done that, hasn't he?
An example of how, actually
mind you, if you want to go back to teaching, maybe not a great idea to slag off teachers when you're an MP. Would be an observation someone might make.
Possibly.
All right, so you would pay MPs more, but have that bigger chunk of money being responsible for a lot. So would you get rid of the allowances then and bundle it all into one big pot? Have I understood you correctly?
I think not all of the. I think travel and accommodation, because I think a lot of MPs do need a second. You need somewhere to be in London. It's not always possible to commute. But I think the idea that you're claiming for paper clips and stamps and all that kind of stuff. No, we're just going to pay you.
But I'm interested in your idea that you take this big chunk of cash and then you actually, out of that, if I've understood you correctly, you fund your parliamentary staff. So you might decide to pay your office manager. And in my experience, a lot of the office managers are actually doing the job of the MP.
They're doing phenomenal jobs.
They keep a lot of stuff ticking over. You might just go, well, actually, do you know what? I can chuck money at this problem and get someone who's really good for 65 grand a year. But you also might get some MPs who just go, do you know what? I want to keep more of the money, but I'm going to get an office manager for like 32. Does that work?
I think there is, and I do agree with Emma that on the, when we talk about MPs' expenses, we are wrapping up the staffing budget into the office budget. And there definitely is an incentive for MPs to have large numbers of young staff focusing heavily on casework. Because casework is the stuff that, often wins you votes at the margins. But it's also the bit of the job where you're not really contributing to the parliamentary process or the legislative process. And for those more high-level jobs where actually, ideally you want someone that knows how to read legislation. Ideally you want people with law degrees.
Yeah.
Or at least some background in law. But I think I don't know what it is now, but I think the cap for parliamentary staff is only about 55,000. It's something in that margin.
It's the early 50s.
Yeah, which does essentially mean that that is quite a low ceiling to get anybody with any legislative expertise. And if you're an MP that has no legislative background, but you have great ideas and great enthusiasm and you have lots of the other skills, but you don't have great legislative experience, you don't know how to read a parliamentary bill. If your cap is that low, you will struggle to find. You will basically have to ask someone to take a massive pay cut. So I don't think I would increase the budget for staffing. If anything, I might trim it, but I might give them a lot more flexibility in terms of actually how much you pay. So if you just want one brilliant member of staff that has a law degree, that is an expert on this stuff and will deal with that, but you want to pay them £75,000-£80,000, I would be sympathetic to that.
Such an interesting debate. Listen, let's move it on a little bit. We're a couple of weeks away from the 1st of May, local elections in England, and we also have the Runcorn and Helsby by-election. Let's just do a little bit of crystal balling. There you are. Emma, what do you think is going to happen? Is this going to be the moment that Reform starts to get loads of council seats and gets yet another MP? What are we thinking?
I think on the council, that's quite likely. I think you'll see Reform-run councils in some places. We've all got local mayors as well. Yeah. I think they're almost certainly to get, at least a couple of those. Yeah. And then they will have significant national-ish figures. If you have a mayor with a decent amount of power in an area which has, some good urban hubs, some good economic power behind it, you're quite likely to have a few Reform voices that can carry on a national level. Now, how Nigel Farage copes with that, that's a question.
You've been looking at my questions. Yeah.
that will be interesting. I had actually, I must admit, this is terrible for me to confess, I'd forgotten that by-election was happening, which I think says a lot about how much attention it's
been dragging on for quite a long time.
The bookies have Reform winning that one.
Yeah, it's the favourite. Yeah.
Now, I don't know how reliable the bookies are when it comes to by-elections in terms of knowledge on the ground. Of course, it would mean that they'd have the same number of MPs as they started with at the beginning of this Parliament. They'd be back to 5, but I think that one could be quite close. By-elections can be so susceptible.
Well, the turnout's always lower.
Yeah.
And I think if you do put in the legwork, you do get the results. I mean, from everything that I've read, it rather suggests the Conservatives aren't really doing a great deal in that particular constituency. So it comes down to Labour or Reform.
And Labour will be throwing everything at it. They will have the resources. They'll have the manpower. They'll have the volunteers. They'll have the patronage. Critically, they'll have the... they have 414 MPs now. They have all the different... all the cabinet ministers. If you're an aspiring SPAD, if you're aspiring parliamentary staff in one of those 414 seats, you're going to be getting on the first train to Runcorn. So
of course you are. Yeah.
They will have the manpower. I imagine Reform will have to rely a little more on the air war than the ground war, and they're both important. But
it's really interesting. I mean, again, I don't want to misquote you, but you said that you could see Reform running some councils off the back of the 1st of May. Do you share that, Elliot?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Yeah.
Is that a good thing for Reform? And let me tell you why I'm asking that question, because there's not a great deal of local government experience. And after 3 or 4 months of running a local council and potentially not really know what you're doing or making some mistakes along the way, I mean, that kind of stuff could be massively damaging and be used as great ammunition for your rivals in the future.
Yeah, and local government is in such a mess that it's likely whatever town hall they're taking over is going to be an absolute chaos. They're going to have budgetary decisions coming on them very, very quickly. They'll have their finance officer telling them that they need to do this, and this to balance the budget. And if they don't have experience, they won't know how to stand up to those officials, and they won't know actually what to be looking into. So, I'm
wondering if there's a narrative.
What they wish for.
A narrative developing, which is it might be great to win these councils, but actually you might not want to win a great many councils in these elections because you're going to have to prove that you can deliver stuff. And as you mentioned, Elliot, local government's a basket case, right?
Well, at some point there'll be, a local election in Birmingham where there's going to be a party, probably the Conservatives, saying that they want to take over Birmingham Council. And
Yeah. Okay, and where does this leave the Tories, do we think, the 1st of May? I mean, last time a lot of these local elections were contested for council seats. They were riding on the crest of a wave. They won't be doing that now, so the theory is they're going to lose a load. Is that a massive issue for Kemi Badenoch, or is it kind of priced into where she's at currently?
I think to some extent it is priced in.
Yeah.
It obviously depends on how bad it is. No one's expecting it to be good. I think that's key. No Conservative thinks they're going to come out of these local elections with any gains, or at least massive gains. So it's priced in to a certain extent. It depends how bad it is, and it just depends how Kemi handles it as well. What does she say afterwards? Does she manage to deal with it and move on? If there is a lot of disgruntled Conservatives and it festers, that becomes a problem for her later down the line.
I think that's the fear, isn't it? Because I mean, I find. I was saying to someone else a couple of weeks ago, because they were just going, Kemi's clearly not the answer. And I'm like, you've got to surely take a step back from this. Was a Conservative Party member, by the way. You've got to take a step back. Because I think if you change your leader again, the general public, the normal people outside of Westminster and SW1 will just go, you are seriously incompetent. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, and I think the people that want to change in leader, I think they all have a preferred candidate, but there's absolutely nothing to say that it will be that preferred candidate. I mean, we've seen what happens in leadership elections. Yeah. So, I think it's probably mostly supporters of Robert Jenrick that would like a leadership election. I understand why. He's been very, very active since he lost, and fair play to him. But there's absolutely no reason why, if they launched another leadership election, you wouldn't accidentally end up with James Cleverly. And suddenly you're then having to do it all over again until you eventually get the one that you want. And so I think... and
like you say, in the meantime, the public are listening less and less and less because you don't seem plausible, you don't seem competent, you don't seem in control anymore.
Yeah.
I think they need to let her...
I think so.
It's only been, 6 months? Not even 6 months?
Yes, 6
months. Since November? It will be mad to not let her have her time to actually bed in and
I think
deal
I
with
agree,
the loss.
and it's so hard when you're in opposition to get any kind of cut through, let alone with a brand new leader. It's
well,
really
if the only
difficult.
cut through you're getting is we've changed leaders again, then that's not the cut through you want.
Yeah.
And it's this expectation as well to that anytime someone becomes leader of the opposition, they should be the finished product, which I just think is, it's so dramatically narrows your pool. And if the Conservatives get in a position where they lose a couple of elections, there will be no finished products left. And at some point, you'll have to sort of take the plunge and say, let's, maybe a steep learning curve, but we need to give someone a chance.
Yeah. And just in the interests of balance, as we try to be occasionally from time to time on this particular podcast, we've talked about Tories, we've talked about reform. Where do we think Labour and the Lib Dems are sitting when it comes to particularly the local elections on the 1st of May?
I mean, Ed Davies probably on a paddle boat in a river somewhere, throwing himself off a wind kite or something. Like, they're not taking it seriously.
I started calling him the Benny Hill of politics, but I realised that only works if you're of a certain generation. What do you think about the Lib Dems and Labour?
I think Benny Hill of politics is accurate, yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're going to take seats. I mean, there's an idea that they might do some damage to the Tories in Buckinghamshire and Devon.
Yeah, there's some of those home counties. Again, there's also some of those counties which have had their elections delayed because of the proposed unitarisation, which will damage Lib Dems, certainly. So, I think, for Labour, it's just, they know it's going to be bad, and they're just hoping it's not going to be too bad.
Yeah, stick on the old tin hat.
Yeah.
Listen, it's been great. Emma, thank you for joining us. Will you come back on a future episode?
Of course, if you ask me back. I'll be here.
Marvellous. Emma Revell, External Affairs Director, Centre for Policy Studies. Thank you for joining us. Find out more at cps.org.uk. Have I got that right?
Us, yeah, that's
Marvellous.
us.
And Elliot, thank you as well. If you want to get in contact at all, the email address is podcast@taxpayersalliance.com. Love getting your emails. If you want any questions asked or maybe suggestions for future guests on what we do here. And also, if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or YouTube, please follow us, subscribe, and just help spread the word. Until next time, thank you for listening.